13th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there, while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly. But since they had no depth of soil, when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches it away, what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. For what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word immediately, receives it with joy, but such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. Jesus is telling a story. Listen, he says. A sower went out to sow. He's telling a story, and these few words are all he needs to get the attention of the crowd that's gathered on the beach. They like stories, especially stories about things they can understand. And since in their world, almost everyone has had the experience of growing something, when Jesus launches into a story about a sower, well, he's speaking their language. So Jesus says, a sower went out to sow, and the crowd leans in. They want to hear what comes next. Well, says Jesus, some of the seed fell on the path. Ah, yes, thinks the crowd, it does that. It's irritating, but you're bound to waste some that way. Still, the path is narrow and not too much is lost. Jesus continues. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it started well, but when the sun came up, it just didn't have enough soil and it shriveled up and died. Well, now the crowd is starting to wonder about this sower. Doesn't he know his fields? Hasn't he worked this ground enough to realize where the bedrock is close to the surface? You can't help but throwing some seed on the path, but it seems wasteful to toss it about on the rocks. This sower cannot be much of a farmer. But there's more. Some seed, Jesus says, fell among the thorns. Oh, come on, says the crowd. That's ridiculous. Who'd sow seed in amongst thorns? Didn't this farmer's father teach him the proper way to sow his fields? Of course, we do finally hear that some seed falls on good ground. But by this stage, the crowd probably feels it's more by luck than any farming skill. This sower is not gardener of the year. The only redeeming factor is that despite the apparent ineptitude of the sower, the seed that falls on the good ground thrives, and there's a good harvest, a bumper crop. But that doesn't change the fact that the crowd would probably not have thought very highly of this sower. He really doesn't seem to know what he's doing, casting seed indiscriminately all over the place. What a waste! What kind of farmer throws so much of his seed into places where it almost certainly won't grow? The crowd would probably answer that only a very foolish farmer would do this. But there's a second possibility. What if this sower has an unlimited supply of seed, and an unlimited amount of time and patience with which to sow it. This second type of sower can toss the seed around as freely as he or she likes, even onto the most unlikely soil. There's nothing to lose and everything to gain. It might look like sowing foolishly, but who knows? Perhaps one or two odd seeds might find a way to grow along the broken edges of the path, or in some little pocket of deeper soil in the rocks, or even in a clear patch among the thorns. After all, the good soil might not be all in one neat fenced-off block. The story doesn't say it is, and we're not dealing with modern factory farming methods here. In fact, back then, the only way to discover where all the good soil really was in your field, soil that might support a growing plant, was to cover the whole area with seed and see what came up. This is what Jesus has been doing as we read through the Gospel of Matthew to this point. And he's been coming in for some pretty harsh criticism from the religious elite. He's been healing people they thought were unclean, and eating and drinking with tax collectors and others labeled as sinners. This is against their tradition, and they're offended by it. It must have seemed to these leaders that Jesus was dragging God's name through the mud. Why waste your time on bad people, the ones who showed by their lifestyle that they don't care about God? God will never grow anything good in their lives. In other words, spending time and energy on them seems as useless as throwing precious seed onto the pathway for the birds, or scattering it among rocks or thorns. If Jesus really wants to do good, he should keep company with virtuous people who show their seriousness about God by the way that they live. But Jesus has discovered that even in the unlikely soil of tax collectors, there will be some who are just longing to hear the word of welcome and love he brings. In fact, they're far more likely to hear it than some of those righteous people who think they already have everything all figured out. Zacchaeus comes down from his sycamore tree. Matthew leaves his tax desk. Other unlikely people find God at work in their lives too. Lepers are healed. Women, even prostitutes, find dignity and a welcome they have never known before. To the people of that time, these lives might not have looked like promising ground, but a rich harvest is springing up among them somehow. The good soil shows itself by what it grows, and there is far more of it, in far less obvious places than is dreamed of in the narrow understanding of those who hold religious power. In our time, just as in the time of Jesus, those who see themselves as religious insiders can sometimes be much too quick to leap to conclusions about where the good soil is and what it looks like. We can behave as if it's our responsibility to dispense or withhold God's blessing, as if there was only a limited amount of it to go around and we have to be really careful not to waste any. When we behave this way, we can make people feel that their experience and understanding of God can't possibly be valid because they don't have the stamp of approval of some authorized religious body. Or they may feel that they have to check off all the boxes we set before them, believe the right things, behave in ways we've decided, all before they can be entrusted with a tiny ration of seeds to grow in their lives. Sometimes people will come to a particular church for a long time, yet still feel that somehow their lives are too trodden down like that pathway, or too stony or thorny for them to dare think that anything of God might take root in them. That's something that only happens to the righteous. But the message of today's story is that this is not so. God's love and grace are not limited. They are not going to run out, and God spreads them around far more generously than we can ever imagine. Just as in today's story, God's love and grace are thrown about everywhere. God is at work in places, people, and situations that we might never expect. God doesn't need protecting by human rules and fences built to keep out what we might think is unclean and unsavory. God can cope with our messes and our mistakes far better than we can. What kind of careless sower flings the seeds of love about with reckless abandon? The kind of sower whose love is inexhaustible, whose hope is unquenchable, who looks at each one of us and sees not the downtrodden paths, the stones or the thickets of thorns, but those patches of good soil, which seem so small to us, but turn out to be big enough for the seed of God's love to take root and grow. Amen.